Welcome to the second session in a global perspective on emerging technologies, a series of business lightning talks. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of our attendees and colleagues around the world. My name is Carla Ruffer, and I am the Outreach Coordinator for the Center for European Studies at the University of Florida. I'm joined by my colleagues from the University of Texas at Austin South Asia Institute, the University of Maryland Robert H. Smith School of Business, Center for Global Business, and the George Washington University Center for International Business Education and Research. The event is also co-sponsored by the Georgia Institute of Technology Center for International Business Education and Research, the Indiana University Center for International Business Education and Research, San Diego State University Wendy Gillespie Center for Advancing Global Business, Texas A&M Mays Business School Center for International Business Studies, and the University of Washington Foster School of Business Global Business Center. We have our third and final session of this series on December 7th, and we hope that you can join us for that session as well. Brief housekeeping notes. Each speaker will present for about 15 minutes. These talks are designed to provide flashes of information and insight. We will have a few moments of Q&A at the end of each session. If you are interested in asking a question, please submit that through the Q&A button. You can submit these questions at any time during the presentation. The subject of emerging technology is broad. Our speakers today will show some of that range by focusing on technology leapfrogging, artificial intelligence, and robots. And without further ado, let's begin. Our first speaker is Vijay Mahajan. His talk is Digital Leapfrogs, How Technology is Reshaping Consumer Markets in India. Dr. Mahajan is the John P. Harbin Centennial Chair in Business at McCombs School of Business at the University of Texas at Austin. He has received numerous Lifetime Achievement Awards, including the American Marketing Association, AMA, Charles Coolidge Parlin Award for Visionary Leadership in Scientific Marketing. The AMA also instituted the Vijay Mahajan Award in 2000 for career contributions to marketing strategy. And with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Mahajan.
Thank you so much, Carla. It's a pleasure to be here. And Sidra, if you can start sharing the slides, please. So this is the title of my presentation. And Sidra, please do keep me on the time schedule. It's called Digital Leapfrog, How Technology is Reshaping Consumer Markets in India. Actually, the book also covers, I had picked two countries, the Kenya in Africa and India in Asia. I had also picked China, but I could not get too many interviews there. And so the objective of this show there is that how much technology is really making a difference in emerging markets. And so the India now is the largest in terms of the population, is the fifth largest in terms of the global economy. And so, but I started this project about 5 years ago before COVID. So a lot of my thinking actually changed during the COVID time. In fact, I had to rewrite this book. This book was released last year by HarperCollins. And so I'm just going to give you a summary of what you'll find in this book. Next slide, please. And this is actually I call it my upper midlife crisis. Some years ago, this is not a typical research that I do. Most of my research is quantitative and diffusion of innovations. But 5 years ago, I got interested in the developing countries. When I went to India as a dean of the Indian School of Business in Hyderabad. And so I was surprised actually what I was saying and how much I had changed by living in Austin, Texas for 2-3 decades. And so first book is called 86% Solution. Reason is called 86% Solution is that 86% of the world population lives in developing countries. The most of them, as you can guess, will be in Asia, Africa. When I started the journey, even many of the Eastern European countries were developing countries, so and so forth. Anyhow, so I won't bore you with the rest of the books, but the new book, I was finding the technology everywhere. So that's what I decided to look at, do the last book on the digital leapfrogs. Next slide, please. So what are you going to find? 3 things that you're going to find. The first thing that you're going to find there is that almost all these countries are navigating across centuries. So when you look at that, there are many of the things that they're trying to do, or many of the initiatives they have, They really are the initiatives that we have taken care of in the developed world, for example, in the United States. Second thing that you're going to find is that this is the first innovation that has democratized the consumer markets. And I'll talk about that in a moment. And the third thing that you'll find in this book there is that in terms of its depth, it's very broad. It has literally affected almost every industry that one can imagine. Consumer markets, I would say. Next slide. So let me first talk about the first takeaway. So many years ago, there was a very bright professor at University of Michigan, C.K. Prahalad, and he has suggested the pyramid shape that you see on the left-hand side of my screen, A, B, C, D, E. A, B, C, D, E are the socioeconomic classification that almost all the countries have it. And so if you're a developed nation, you tend to have a diamond-shaped curve, meaning the C is much larger than A and B and D and E. But in developing countries, the D and E in many countries tends to be very large, and some countries, the C is very small. So this happens when you have either rich people or the poor people. But what you see now, the emerging markets, for example, in India has started looking like a diamond shape, and so is Kenya. And this data is actually available in my book. So since the C class has become very important, so a lot of this revolution is being driven by the middle class families. So in case of India, for example, they have about 80 million people, 80 million in the middle class, 80 to 90 million households, I should say, about 360 million people. These people have nothing but aspirations. They want their children to do better. They want to do better. So during the COVID time, many of them actually did not want to compromise on the education of their children. So they bought the phones, and it really gave a big boost to actually the technology in India. A lot of the new companies, especially in the education sector and the health sector, they came up during the COVID time. And the D and E also has become very aspirational. The interesting thing about the digital technology is that it has gone all the way from the A class to E class. So do not be surprised if you go to Kenya or if you go to India these days, you will find a taxi driver having a mobile phone. Don't be surprised if many of them are actually watching the movies on the YouTubes. Do not be surprised if they're communicating with their clients actually by using the smartphones, because the prices are decreasing. And so so in terms, I don't be surprised if you see somebody from the D and E class actually watching cricket during the spare time when they're waiting for their clients. And so it has democratized. So this is the first innovation that I have seen, which has gone across all socioeconomic classifications. Next slide, please. In terms of a depth, I looked at many sectors. An interesting thing there is the first time that you see the private sector and the public sector are really doing it jointly. Education, one of the largest world companies called Bayou, which is also getting some negative publicity these days for mismanaging their some of the issues that they have. Education is very active. During the COVID time, that's how people actually went to schools. The public services, government of India, they call it the Digital India. They have so many public services. As a matter of fact, almost every social product they have, although we're sending the money to the D and E class in the rural areas, they are actually sending it digitally. They made available the bank accounts, zero balance bank accounts to everybody, which was a major the controversy in India in the beginning, but it turns out to be a blessing. Finance, fintech is taking everywhere. Agriculture, 60% of people work in the agriculture sector. And so how to increase the productivity? The healthcare, again, the same thing. Media entertainment, the same thing with media and entertainment. People are watching the shows anywhere they go. The YouTube, the Facebook, and so on and so forth. Next slide. But interesting thing is what you realize there is that these countries are very rural. So here are examples of some of the countries. And this graph that you see, this is for the US. This is how the US actually urbanized over time, starting from 1820. So notice there that Vietnam, India, and Bangladesh are still where the United States was back in 1890. Pakistan is where the United States was in 1900. China is where the United States was in 1940. So many of these countries are still rural. And it took the United States almost from the 1940, where the China is today, to the 2023, it took them almost about 92 years to get to the 81% urbanization. So these people are, that's the reason they're also going across the centuries, meaning they still have the problem, toilet problem, electricity problem, clean water problem. Next slide, please. And so most of these rural people tend to be in Asia and Africa and Central America, but mostly. Between Africa and the Asia, they have about 3.4 billion rural consumers, almost about 48% of our population, maybe a little bit less. 1 billion of them are in South Asia. So that's why the story that I have in this book becomes very important. That 1/3 of the rural consumers who are in the developing countries are actually in South Asia, between Pakistan, Bangladesh, and India. Next slide, please. And other thing that you have to see there is, if you look at, compared with Houston, no state in India, including Bombay, Maharashtra, are including the Bangalore in Karnataka, the digital city, even the prime minister's state itself, Gujarat, none of them have their economy bigger than Houston, and only 5 of them have the economy bigger than Austin, Texas. So you can imagine in terms of economic growth, they're really very, very behind. Despite that, they are creating this digital revolution. In fact, that's why it's a leapfrog. Next slide. And you can see on the streets, the most important, one of the very interesting movie that came out in Bollywood was Toilet, A Love Story, where the lady refused to go to the husband's house because he did not have a toilet. And it was a true story. And so, and interesting thing is that then when they were quoting each other, they were using a smartphone. So on the smartphone, they're taking the pictures and sharing with each other, but at the same time fighting about the toilet. Right hand, you see an advertisement for Google. So it says, when the nature calls, use your phone. That's because Google has no maps on the toilets. So even when you're going for shopping or something, as a tourist, you can find a toilet. So this is what I mean by the navigating across the centuries. Next slide. But interesting thing there is that despite the fact that navigating across a century, we did this data in the middle of the COVID. And what you notice there is that India happens to be the largest market for Facebook, WhatsApp, and Instagram. And so it's not a coincidence that these companies are all there, and they're very aggressively there. Because they cannot go to China, but India is the largest. So they are very aggressively there. And you can see from this picture that how this has filtered down all the way to E-class. So at the bottom, what you see there is the person who actually has accidentally abdicated the world. That's the way he lives. And he takes this part, and the people can give him alms or food or whatever. And on the top, what you see there, the Buddhist monk who has also abdicated the whole world. They do not believe in the material things. But conversation is important. Next slide. And what you see here also there is that this is the data we collected on April 2020 when I was doing the book. The largest number of the Zoom downloads were actually in India. So just imagine that a country which is still struggling has the largest, and these days everybody is doing their Zoom there, the offices and so on and so forth. But idea here to indicate there is that despite who they are, they're really doing very well when it comes to the digital technologies. The next slide. COVID time, you can imagine there are 10 million points of purchase. It's a small mom and pop stores in India. And Unilever is the largest company. And so they made a lot of investments because typically the salespeople used to go to these stores to stock their products. So this is what you see there is a Unilever store from somewhere in Bangalore. And so they actually invested a lot of money in developing an app because the salespeople could not go. And the people were ordering from the app. And so this really accelerated the adoption of the phone plus the apps in India. And at the same time, they have to reshape their entire supply chain to make sure that they could actually supply these products. So this case study is also including the book. So I had a great interview with the CEO who invested in this money. Next slide. This is again the amazing company that they connect the buyers and the sellers together, but most of the sellers are coming from, since the 69% of the India population, sorry, beg your pardon, 70-some population is in the rural areas, farming is still the very big deal. And so they have connected all these farmers and small shopkeepers, very unique things that they produce to all over the world. So for example, the region of India that I come from, a state of Jammu and Kashmir, we have a cheese which is very popular called Kaladi, which you will not find anywhere. So I tease this, the founders, can I buy this product? So Shorana went to his website and he said, here is a guy who's about 20 miles away, 15 miles away from your hometown, and he's selling this product. I could not believe that. I just jumped out of my chair that a small farmer coming from a very small town was actually in the global market. And so they went public 2 years ago, and you can see they have 99 categories. During the Ramadan time, people from the Middle East actually are able to buy the animals, like the goats and for the whatever on this website. Next slide. This is the biggest disruption that took place in the trucking industry. So trucking industry in the old days, and we're still there in the US, when the things used to come on Bombay, they'll be transported. Same truck driver will go all the way to the north, and the poor guy may be gone for 3 or 4 weeks, for months from his home, but not anymore. So they have used, one entrepreneur has started a system called Relay, just like the Relay they used to have. That's how the Genghis Khan started the post office system. That the horse would go for 10 miles and it'll pass on the post to somebody else, they pass on the post somebody else, they pass on to somebody else. And so each person actually could stay in their territory. No, these truck drivers stay in the territory, and every day they go back. Everything on that truck that you see is digital. They know exactly what is going on the tires. They know exactly what is going on the digital, on the engine. And every day the money is actually transferred to his bank account. And so this is a major, major disruption that you see. I think I'm running out of time, so I'm going to skip the rest of the examples. So the next slide. This is in the agriculture sector I was going to talk about, but you can see that. Next slide. This is, I was going to talk about how they have connected this is a very major the initiative by Facebook, Fuel for India 2020, very major. And there, the only way you can do there is if you go to the villages. And so there's and a lot of the NGOs are also participating with these people. Next slide. So this is my last slide. The pictures that you see, they are taken from the Government of India website. So these people, you can imagine how the government itself is so actively involved. But there are issues. Issue, for example, there is that the education, people cannot participate unless they have smartphones. And there is also gender bias. You'll see in my book in the last chapter there is that they're very biased towards the boys. So that during the COVID time, for example, the boys had a mobile phone, the girls did not. So there's a gender issue. There is a major thing is about the diaspora. For example, in the United States, there are 3.8 million of the people of the Indian heritage, including me and my children. And this constitutes only one major city in India, Jaipur, which is in Rajasthan. So the Indian population in the United States is equal to the population of one city in India. But these people collectively send $25 billion every year back to India. India is the largest recipients of the remittances. So now, how do you make it cheap? Interesting enough, again, the technology. Other day, I went to the temple here, and all the priests there were sending money home by using the Bank of America, the app. And this directly goes into their bank. So, and India unified the platform that they're trying to come up with, and they're trying to sell it to other countries also. It goes quickly, and it's not like Western Union would charge you $35. Within $1 or $2, you are able to actually send everything back home. And so you will see that still there are a lot to do, but it's amazing to see that how far these emerging markets are actually able to take advantage of the digital technology and leapfrog because they don't have any legacy. And same examples you'll find in Kenya also. So given the time, let me stop there. And I want to thank all of you for listening to me. Thank you. Carla?
Thank you so much. That was very interesting. We appreciate it. And you're right on time. I do open it up for questions. While people might have a moment or two to pop questions in the Q&A, I am interested how you said that you had to kind of rewrite the book because of COVID. What of those many technologies leapfrogging that you mentioned was primarily affected by COVID the most?
Well, I think almost everything, because there was no contact. So what happened there is that all the funding from the government went through the digital technologies. It was directly going to, and thank God they had started with zero balance bank accounts. And then they realized that what an important decision they had made. And so also all the way, for example, the e-commerce went up because of the hospitality industry. There were no jobs because there were no tourists, the offices opened. And most of them actually went into the companies like Amazon and the e-commerce companies. And so because all the things were coming on through the digital technology, the platforms. And so that gave a big boost to those. So there were a lot of investment that came in. Education became a big deal. There's a company called Bayou, which is named after the person. And so the middle class, they do not compromise on the education of their children because they know that's their way out. And so for them, it was a very positive investment to actually find a phone. And luckily, the phone prices were also going down, thanks to Jio, thanks to the richest person in India, Mukesh Ambani. He had actually, few years before that, had actually laid the wire throughout the country. He had borrowed about $25-30 billion and wired the whole country. So I think that some of them were the blessing that they had done before, but during this time, it just accelerated. Even the appointments with your physicians and the doctors and so on and so forth, they also went online just like us here. And the fact that they had the largest number of the Zoom downloads, meaning the work was still going on. The offices in Bombay, the Unilevers and Procter & Gamble's and Coca-Cola's and all these guys, they were still working, making sure the products reach where they need to reach. So a lot of investments were done by them also on the supply chain side. So yeah, it was in a way that COVID actually, despite how many people we lost, but I think it gave a big boost to the digital side.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. We will move on to our next speaker, but thank you, Dr. Mahajan, for that presentation.
Thank you so much. I apologize. I need to go and teach. Thank you very much. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye. Our next speaker is Lauren Rue. Her talk is Promise and Peril of AI for Marginalized Populations. Dr. Rue is an assistant professor of information systems in the Department of Decision, Operations, and Information Technologies at the Robert H. Smith School of Business at the University of Maryland. Her research uses empirical and econometric methods to explore the economic and social implications of technology. With that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Rue.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for having me. You've already discussed the name of my presentation, which is The Promise and Peril of AI for Marginalized Populations. Just to give you a little bit of overview about me, I have many research interests, one of which is related to algorithmic bias. So I've looked at machine learned processes, recurring bias, bias in beauty scores, bias in emotion, and broadly speaking, technology for equity. So thinking about digital platforms, increasing equity on digital platforms, disparities, and similarity. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of my ongoing research as well. Just to situate you within AI, I feel as though AI has been so impactful and everywhere, especially over the last year. We've noticed this exponential improvement, and particularly in generative AI. And what I mean by that are AI in which there's something that is created or generated as your output. This is an example of a drawing. So for real estate, you have AI, you also have interior design. And so in this case, someone is trying to think of how they would lay out the furniture in a room, and this can improve the process for designers. This is an example of an AI generated promo piece for Black Panther. Someone said, I really think there should be a prequel, and here's what it should look like. And that ended up snowballing to the point that there were calls to actually create this because the visual imagery was so evocative. This is a fake person who was created from Unreal.com and then a seascape. So I don't need to belabor this point anymore. AI is just increasing dramatically in its capabilities. One of the challenges, of course, are these believable hallucinations. And so this is an entirely fake person. This is a female assistant professor of information systems. The entire bio was created by ChatGPT. The people and her cat were also created online as well. I mean, so there's this definite peril that can come from having these believable hallucinations. The second is predictive AI, and by which I mean AI that is trained to predict some type of an outcome, can find these unwanted patterns. And so this is more of what we're going to be focusing on in my talk today, thinking about automated hiring, for example. And so this is going to predict how good a fit a candidate is. And that has been shown to have bias. Amazon very famously reported that its recruiting tool was biased against women. There was a beauty contest judged by an AI, and the AI preferred lighter skinned models. Another very famous piece from Science, this research found that a widely used algorithm had a preference for more affluent white patients at the expense of sicker but less affluent Black patients. and of course, the US criminal justice system, and concerns over the accuracy of facial recognition. So you can find all of these unwanted patterns in predictive AI. So the total summary, if I had to put my talk in one slide, would be that the promise and peril of AI for marginalized populations is that AI can reduce bias, but it can also perpetuate bias. So how can we focus on the former, so the bias reduction, and minimize the latter, perpetuating bias? But while I've been talking about AI as a bit of a monolith, it's not. There's many different models that exist in organizations worldwide. So I'm dividing it into two categories. The first is generative AI, and that's large language models. This is what everyone has been talking about. You have large language models like ChatGPT that are able to create language, that are able to summarize. And it's really exciting, all of the possibilities that come with large language models. People generation is another example. So what I mean by that, you have either digital avatars or you have images of people that don't exist at all. And they've been used for digital models. They've been used to create as illustrations in books to create that. Deepfakes are another example of generative AI. You have your voice, maybe a real person's voice, and then you also have maybe a real person's face, but you merge them together so that this person is saying something in somebody else's voice that they never said. And then lastly is the interior design example I mentioned before, in which maybe that furniture doesn't exist or that furniture has never been in that room, and you're able to create a picture of what it would look like together and seamlessly integrate them. Some examples of predictive AI are supply chain optimization. And so in that case, you're trying to figure out where things should go to try to make your supply chain as efficient as possible. Object detection. So let's say you have vision, you have a picture and you're trying to figure out what's in that picture. Is it cats? Is it a train? Real estate valuation is another example. In that case, you're trying to predict how much a house will sell for. Emotion detection, you have a face and you're trying to figure out what emotion is in that face. And then credit scoring is another example. How likely is somebody to pay back money? Essentially, how worthy are they of having credit extended towards them? When we talk about some of the concerns and consequences, particularly related to AI bias, there has to be a component of people. So it's really at that intersection of where AI touches people that we have to start thinking about these examples. So the AI must affect individuals, whatever the model is, and it can affect individuals in many ways. One is in the training data. So as records, if you're training an AI on, let's say, student records or on employee records, then the people who you're training, who the model is using as training data, are naturally affected. Another example are in the features of the model. So if you are looking at, let's say, a real estate evaluation, maybe the characteristics of the people who live in the neighborhood are being used as features of the model, then naturally AI is going to affect them. So if you're looking at a place with high income earners or high education, and that increases the value of your property, that'll affect all of the people who live there. Of course, in the consequences, if you're using AI to make hiring decisions, it's going to certainly influence the people who you're making the up or down decision on. And then lastly, of course, in the generated output. So if you are generating people or generating stories about people, that's naturally going to affect those people. So that's just to situate you. Overall, the promise of AI to deal with some of these negative outputs have to do with AI advancement. It's going to have far-reaching impact. We've already seen it, and it's going to continue having this really far-reaching impact. And one of the biggest and most exciting opportunities is identifying opportunities for traditionally overlooked people. So in some of my research, I've looked at using AI/machine learning to increase equity in promoting marginalized founders, and this is on a digital platform. And we find that if you use AI to make that determination on who gets recommended and promoted, then it's going to be a more diverse pool than if you use humans. Something similar was also found with algorithmic lenders, and that's reducing rate disparities. And this actually ties in with the last pieces, with the last presentation as well, that as you have more and more broader and diverse set of places to invest, it might be useful to use AI to try to make some of those determinations to try to predict where would be a good place to invest, because perhaps there's patterns that we don't know. This is all very new. Another place in which you can expect to see this benefit towards marginalized populations is obfuscating identity or identity cues that trigger bias. And so a paper that I've worked on with Jessica Clark, who's another professor at Maryland, we find that identity cues can trigger bias and lead to less successful outcomes, but you can now use AI to obfuscate some of those identity cues. So for example, you could use ChatGPT to mask grammatically incorrect English, and that's going to improve the overall writing capabilities of people who maybe have less education. You could also use AI to mask names. So names are another example, another way in which people's identities enter into, let's say, hiring decisions when it shouldn't. And then also using generative AI, let's say, to mask pictures if you're thinking about online or digital platforms. So there's some just examples of ways in which you can use AI towards to reduce bias. You could also, of course, enable auditing. So this will give you a chance to try to figure out what's happening in your organization, what AIs are doing, and just making sure that you do not have any discriminatory behavior. And so this is an example of what I mentioned before, just very quickly. You can see that there's an increase in using machine learning. We see this going from 6.4% to 7%. And when you use fairness-aware machine learning, it goes up to almost 10%. The peril, though, is also AI advancement, as funny as that is. And part of it's because there are some concerns over the ways in which AI can replace human labor and which jobs are more at risk. There was a report that came out that looked at the ways in which large language models might reduce opportunities for knowledge and creative work. There's also the perception of knowledge and creative work, job replacement, right? And even if this work is not being replaced, there's a real concern about what it means for employees to be in fear of a large language model or a smart AI coming and taking their job. Also, of course, this can replicate human bias and reinforce stereotypes. So we know that actually in society, there are these undesirable associations between certain populations, and that can be reproduced in large language models. And you can see that in other things as well, in facial analysis, which I alluded to earlier. So the big question is, what's next? In this predictive AI machine learning process, bias and these inequities can affect every step in the process. And this is the paper that's already out there. And so in the interest of time, I don't want to belabor this point too much, but it really takes a holistic approach to trying to tackle some of these problems. The algorithmic solutions are related to aligning your algorithm and your data set, representative data, considering data processes, and accounting for historical bias. If you are in an organization that has access to the underlying model, for other organizations, you have to think about what these ethical issues are. So how do you identify them? Using dashboards, trying to create these key performance indicators for what fairness looks like. Figuring out if there is an unfair decision or an unfair model, how can you overturn that model? And then also any processes that you can put on the above in the beginning, the procurement section, as well as in the use and implementation to make sure the model is as non-discriminatory as it can be. But this is also something else, is that AI, as we know, is international. It crosses international borders. For one, US data is being used to train and generate information for other populations. If you look at a lot of these large language models, they were trained on Reddit data or Wikipedia. It's very English language heavy, right? What is that going to mean as we think about the use of these models in other situations for which they're not trained? There's also a legality question, right? So a model might be illegal because it uses biometric data in one country, but then it's used in another country. So how is that friction? What is that friction going to do to the dissemination of AI models? And there's also different legal structures. So classes that are protected in one country or one political entity may not be protected in another. So you have GDPR, which really does gird so much of AI development in Europe. There's also the new executive order in the US related to AI that just came out on Monday. All of these different expectations and standards are going to shift and create these boundaries for what AI is and how you can try to have AI exhibit this non-discriminatory behavior. And then, of course, variations in fairness and civil protections. Not only is there that legal difference, but also cultural expectations of fairness. What fair looks like in the US may not be what fair looks like somewhere else. And how can you have a model that's maybe developed by a US country or developed by a European or a Chinese country actually handle these different definitions of what fairness means based off of where it's being used and enacted? So I'm almost out of time, but some of the open questions for organizations include, how can organizations use AI to meet these standards for non-discriminatory behavior? In the US, there's a current push to develop these standards as a part of this executive order. So how are organizations going to shift their use to meet those new standards? And also promoting inclusivity in their workforce, promoting inclusivity for their customers. And there's all sorts of opportunities that you can use with AI to do that. And then how can you adhere to these international expectations and juggle the potentially conflicting views? This is a very exciting time to start thinking about AI because it's a pivotal moment. The goal of all of us right now as we try to move through this, incorporating this new technology, is how can we choose the promise and avoid the peril? So thank you very much. And I think I have a few minutes. So are there any questions?
Thank you so much, Dr. Rue. That was very interesting. I appreciate it. Still open for questions, but I do have one. You answered part of it. So because as you mentioned, the recent executive order did address trying to address the biases in AI. Are there other international organizations or governments that are trying to also do that? Because I generally just hear of people trying to avoid things like deep fakes and unethical uses of AI, a little less about the biases inherent in AI.
So that's an interesting question. There's definitely a lot of international interest and pressure from governments, from nonprofits, from privacy watchdogs. And when people say ethical AI, usually part of that is bias that's included in there, right? Because there's this notion of fairness that people should be treated fairly, whether that's individually, whether that's collectively. And so you want to have some type of a process that ensures that there's going to be some type of fairness. And again, that's really for AI that touches people. I've talked to companies that say, I really want to make sure I'm ethical. How do I know that I'm being ethical? And if your AI is something that's related to more supply chain optimization, there's a lot less concern about whether you are discriminating against people or whether it's an ethical AI. It's really when it comes to the intersection of your business and the people that you work with. And as companies become more international, that's going to be a big challenge for them as well. But then, of course, also, really any technology can spread like wildfire. And we've seen that already happen with social media, that social media started in California and then just slowly snowballed. And that's happening with a lot of these pre-trained models as well, right? It's no longer homegrown. You sign up for ChatGPT and now you're chatting with this model. What does that mean if it's trained on data that it is not necessarily your country's data, that's not necessarily specific to your organization and your context?
Do you find that some countries are trying to create data sets that are more specific to their populations?
So there is a push for many folks to fine tune it. And there are some languages in which there's a strong enough barrier that you're not able to just adapt it in the same way. But there definitely is that push to try to make it more localized. But it's an investment. It's a financial investment.
Right. Yes. Well, thank you so much for that talk. We have not had any questions, so we'll go ahead and move on. So thank you so much again. Our next speaker is Radamiro Rodrigo. His talk is The Robot Revolution, Unpacking the Effect of Robots on Emerging Markets. Dr. Rodrigo is an assistant professor of international business at the George Washington University School of Business. His research focuses on the effects of automation on firms and workers. Dr. Rodrigo, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for connecting. Thanks to the organizers for including me in the panel. As it was said, my name is Rodimiro Rodrigo, and I'm assistant professor at George Washington School of Business at the International Business Department. And my research is focused on the effects of automation on firms and workers. And today I'm going to talk about the effect of or the robot revolution, and particularly the effects of robots on emerging markets. So I think that we all have heard about the fourth industrial revolution associated to the adoption of automation technologies, industrial robots. We heard about earlier about the effects on artificial intelligence and digital technologies. And on the one hand, when we heard about this, we heard voices of excitement, right? Voices that are telling us about the benefits, that potential benefits of these technologies for the overall economy, the benefits on increasing productivity, on improving the safetiness at the workplace. Also, voices that remind us that this machinery can help us to actually perform dangerous and highly physical activities and liberate some human labor to actually move toward more value-added activities. But at the same time, we hear voices that are warning us about the high potential for displacement of these technologies, and not only leaving all factories deserted without human labor, but also using this machinery, as was mentioned earlier from Professor Lauren, the case of AI used for different purposes, one of those to even fire people in an automated way, right? So let me here make a small parenthesis to say that for the rest of the talk, when I'm talking about automation, I'm going to be focusing on industrial robots. So more like in the left hand side picture that you see over here, these big robot arms that are performing different tasks in manufacturing. And so, well, the good news to actually kind of inform these mixed feelings of excitement and anxiety is that fortunately, the economic research have made quite a bit progress, right? So if I have to summarize for you the results of this literature, I would say that now we know that, industrial robots have a modest reduction on overall employment and wages. So some of these concerns are actually quite consistent with what we see in the reality. We also see that this phenomenon is quite concentrated in large and young firms, that the displacement effects that are mainly seen in the manufacturing jobs are usually offset by new jobs in the service sector. And that when we take a closer look to the effects on automated firms, actually those firms are the ones that are creating new jobs and expanding their scales, on the contrary, or at expense of their competitors or their non-automated counterparts, right? And that these effects are mainly seen to be displacing particular occupations like production workers and some supervision activities or managers that are less relevant once you have a machinery that can be monitored just with one person instead of many, right? So the fact now at this point, you may have noticed that all of the evidence that I mentioned is concentrated in developed countries. And maybe that is not quite surprising or make a lot of sense, that because if you take a look at the robot adoption intensity, or in particular here, what I'm presenting to you, that is robot density using data from the International Federation of Robotics, you see that most of the action is actually taking place in developed countries, right? So if here I'm just showing to you the adoption in developed countries, and you can see that that is most of the countries are actually in these three top brackets of the distribution, right? From 5 to 100 plus robots per 10,000 workers, the way we measure robot density. The downside of that is that we are missing what are the effects on the rest of the world, right? So in all these red area. And so when we take a look at the same measure, robot density, for these countries, what we see, well, very different levels of adoption, very different patterns of adoption, actually going from for the bottom brackets of this distribution. And many countries actually with no adoption at all. We see that is the case for many countries in South America, many countries in Africa, right? So we cannot extrapolate the effects that we have documented in the developing countries to developed countries to these emerging markets or developing countries overall, right? So actually, if we take a look again to the whole distribution of countries based on their robot density, what we find is that most of the action is taking place in developed countries. Actually, we saw evidence for all these countries in particular, and that we have a big question mark for what's going on with developing countries. So if we want to make a focus or make a zoom in these type of countries to analyze what is affecting these countries, what I'm gonna propose to you is to break them in 3 groups. Basically, countries with relevant local adoption, right, like Brazil, definitely lower than the US or Germany, etc., but still with relevant robot adoption. Then another group of countries like Colombia with very little or no adoption at all, right? And notice here, let me say that we cannot also put in the same basket to Brazil and Colombia, because robot density in Brazil in 2020 was 15 times the density of Colombia. And the stock of robots of Brazil was 80 times the stock as large as in Colombia. So we have to, again, try to be consistent with this critique that we're making and try to analyze apples with apples, right? And a third group that definitely cannot fit in any of these boxes, that is China, whose number of installed robots in 2020 was larger than if you add the installed robots of all the top economies, the 10 largest adopters in fact, right? So for the rest of the talk, I'm gonna present to you evidence from my research for Brazil and Colombia, these 2 type of groups that I mentioned in the beginning, and also some evidence that we have from colleagues from NYU and University of Pittsburgh for the case of China. So let me start with the first group that I was mentioning, the case of the effect of robots on adopters of relevant number of robots, like the case of Brazil. So when I take a look at the effect of robots on labor productivity in a dynamic way, I observe that industrial robots actually increase labor productivity in Brazil. But interestingly, in this graph, I'm showing you actually the dynamic effect over a 10-year period. You will see that in the short run, there is a weak productivity growth that contrasts with the strong productivity growth after 5 years. This is still very relevant because if you take the cumulative effect of adoption, that means that if a local labor market increased by 10 reais per worker of 1997, the currency in Brazil, that would lead to a 2% increase in labor productivity after a 10-year period. So very, very interesting increases on labor productivity. Now, in the paper, I also show how this delayed reaction of productivity, the fact that the gains doesn't happen since the first year, but you actually have to wait for 5 years to see the productivity gains, can be associated to the fact of the big reorganization process of labor across occupations that firms needs to perform in order to see the productivity gains. When we look at the effects on employment, we actually find no effect over a 10-year period, but we see a strong reallocation process going on within the firms, so strong that of workers moving across occupations, mainly going out of production activities and jumping into support-oriented or service-oriented activities, so strong that can actually help to explain 20% of this decrease of production workers as a share of overall employment moving from a 40% to a 30% in a decade, and support workers taking their place. Now, when we move to this second type of countries with very little or actually no adoption, domestic adoption of robots, here you may be wondering how a country that actually is not adopting robots can be harmed by robots, right? So here the question that we try to answer empirically was, can robot adoption in developed countries like the US hurt workers in developing countries like Colombia? So here, the story that we have in mind is the trade channel, right? So basically, firms that are that previously used to offshore production to developing countries to take advantage of cheap labor and other competitive advantages, maybe trying to bring back home production and do that now with these automated technologies, with these industrial robots, right? So with that in mind, what we did was to build a measure of taking advantage of the industrial structure of commuting zones in Colombia. We built a measure of exposure to US robots. And what we found is that local labor markets more exposed to US robots actually faced a decrease in the likelihood of being employed. Their workers also experienced an increase in the likelihood of separations, no effect on hirings, and also we find negative effect on wages, right? Very interestingly, also going back to the mechanism that we had in mind, and that is the trade channel, we show that regions exporting the most to the US suffer the most from this automation abroad, from automation in the US. So finally, I also said that, or we said that China should have their own avenue, right? Because of what? Because we saw that the level of adoption there was not in the order of magnitudes of Colombia or Brazil that was over here, but China was more in the above the mean of all the countries where we have data, right? And actually it's more dramatic, we said, when you look at the stock of robots or the installments of robots. We said that China is a big champion compared to all the rest of the world. And happily, we have now some evidence from researchers for China. In particular, Gintela and co-authors found that one standard deviation increase in the exposure to robots led to a decline in employment of 7.5% and wages on 9%. And in the case of Siemens and co-authors, they actually found that a positive effect of robots on the physical health of young and less educated workers. So those that are presumably more substituted by doing these physical activities that I was mentioning earlier, and now doing more added value or less physical activities, while bringing more mental stress to older and more educated workers. There is a type over there. So another reason to keep paying attention to what is going on in China is the big catch-up that is doing with other economies. So here I'm showing you the historical time series for the case of robot density for China and the US. And you see how China is close to close the gap with the US in particular. So let me wrap up and mention some of the main takeaways of what I present to you this morning. First, we probably agree that given the different levels of adoption between developed and developing countries, we cannot extrapolate the effects that we have estimated in developed countries, right? So we need more research on developing countries, right? I also present to you some evidence for adopter countries like Brazil. And also let me mention that there are other few papers for analyzing Thailand and Mexico that have the same level of adoption as Brazil do. And we find that automation can actually bring substantial productivity gains, but that it may take some time to phase those gains. And in particular, that in the short run, I document that there is a major reorganization of labor across occupations, and that the better we do this process, the faster we will experience the productivity gains. Now, doing better this process may take or may require retraining, managerial skills, complementary investments. So some extra efforts where we can actually provide some extra help to the firms to do better with the new technology. For the low or non-adopter countries like Colombia, I also present to you some evidence, and we saw how automation in developed countries can hurt developing countries even when they haven't gone through this process of automation, right? Why? By modifying their trade patterns. So therefore, some key takeaways here may be that automation decisions by multinational corporations in their home countries should also consider the consequences on their global value chains, right? And for the firms in developing countries, on the other hand, the takeaway is that they should anticipate and be proactive if they want to remain competitive in this globalized world. Finally, for the case of China, I show you this incredible, intense level of adoption that is actually requiring the analysis on its own, right? And not only for the effects for that economy per se, but also we may anticipate that this can have important implications for the trade partners, given the results of my other research. So let me stop over here and listen if there is any question over there.
Thank you so much for that presentation. Again, we are open for questions, but I will go ahead and jump in while we wait. So I was thinking about, particularly from your example in Colombia, if from your research or others' research, we know why there's not a lot of adoption of industrial automation, either from homegrown industries or from multinational industries bringing their robots there.
Yeah, I mean, well, there are many other papers that have thought about why the take in these countries is so low. There are many possible reasons, right? One is the level of industrialization and the local capacities they have. No, the skills demand is quite different, as I show for the case of Brazil. But there are other barriers to entry, definitely. That can be considered that can limit the investment in these big technologies, right?
Mm-hmm. Awesome. And we did have a question from one of the attendees. Have you seen any religious pushback when it comes to technology? It's a question from our guest, Paxton Schubert.
Well, it's true that there is some few papers that are actually analyzing how people feel towards the technology, right? Or their perception to the technology. And it's true that that is something that also play a role, no? Not only the cost-benefit analysis that I was talking to you, but it's true that that can be even more important in developing countries. What is the perception or the feeling toward these technologies? There are reports that tell us that it's true, workers feel some excitement on the one hand, but also predominantly there is some fear to adopting this new technology, and mainly probably what you were suggesting as this religion beliefs. Mainly there is some evidence that tell us that in the case of some in some countries, there is also this perception that is stronger when it's about interacting with these robots. So yeah.
Hey, well, that is actually, the chimes are telling me again that it is time to it's the top of the next hour. So this does conclude the portion of our program. I want to extend a heartfelt thank you, as do all my colleagues, to the audience for joining us, to our speakers for sharing their expertise, as well as to the U.S. Department of Education. We are especially grateful for them because without Title VI funding for National Resource Centers and Centers for International Business Education and Research, we would be unable to present this program to you. So again, please do join us on December 7th for our final part of the Global Perspective on Emerging Technologies. Thank you all very much and have a good rest of your morning, afternoon, or evening.
Thank you.